Hello, and welcome to your Necromancer class guide. This guide will help you decide if you want to play the Necromancer for Diablo 4 launch. By the way, a quick side note, if my eyes look a little red or distorted, it's because I just had LASIK, that's laser eye surgery. It's totally fine, and it's totally cool. In any case, in this guide, we will cover a quick overview of the Necromancer, recommending the best skills for leveling and for endgame, a detailed breakdown of every single Necromancer skill and passive, and finally, you'll want to watch to the end of the video because we're going to cover every single confirmed Necromancer legendary aspect so that you can go ahead and start to plan your build. So sit back, relax, and grab your favorite drink. I have two kinds of custom-made cards for you throughout this video. In the future, these will be self-explanatory, but since Diablo 4 isn't released yet, let's break down the anatomy of each of these quickly. Now, first up, we have the skill card. At the top, we have the skill tree and the skill name, and then we have a resources section with information like resource cost, generation, cooldown duration, or lucky hit chance. Now below that is the skill description telling you about its primary effect. If you spend another skill point, you can pick up the next node in the tree, branching off the skill. This is called the enhancement. If you spend yet another skill point, then you can pick up one of two modifiers for the skill. This is a mutually exclusive choice, so choose wisely. Each modifier has its own prefix, which changes the outcome of the skill itself. Now finally, at the bottom, you'll see the version number of the game that the skill is associated with. This isn't terribly useful right now, but it'll be useful in the future when we compare skill changes across new versions of the game. I've already observed some very large changes between the press preview and the beta, and you're not going to really see this information anywhere else. So make sure that you're subscribed. Second, let's take a look at the aspect card. This is designed like a legendary item in the game. You're gonna see the title at the top. On the top right, you'll see an icon that matches the category of the aspect. In this case, we have a defensive aspect. Below that is the star of the show, the effect. Below that is the allowed item types, which tells you which slots that this power can roll on or be imbued upon. A quick note here that you'll notice in time, not every class has a shield slot, so I denote the shield item with an asterisk. Finally, some legendary aspects can be unlocked and used from the Codex of Power. The requirements of these aspects are listed on the bottom if they are in the Codex of Power. Finally, just like the skill card, I have the version number of the game on the very bottom, which again will be useful for comparisons later down the road. The Necromancer is a class of blood, bone, and darkness, alongside wielding an army of skeleton warriors, skeletal mages, and one golem of your choice. Necromancer's primary strengths include the incredible ability Blood Mist, which can make them entirely immune to all damage and effects, Corpse Explosion, and blood skills, which do incredible area of effect damage, and the insane critical hits that you can get with bone skills, out of which Bone Spirit has the highest damage multiplier of any skill in the entire game. Their primary weakness is movement speed, as the class has absolutely no movement skill options whatsoever. This means that a level 13 rogue with Shadow Step will likely outspeed your completely maxed out God of Death Necromancer. Corpses will be very difficult to generate on bosses if you're going for a Corpse Explosion based build, and sometimes you're going to find Essence to be in short supply. You'll have to rely on a couple of important resource aspects to really get your mana battery charged. Necromancer's most important skills for leveling are Blood Surge, Corpse Explosion, and Bone Spear. Depending on which legendary aspects drop for you or the route that you take throughout Sanctuary, that'll help you determine which of these that you should focus on. Blood Surge is an incredible AoE skill and will demolish packs of monsters early on, even without any legendary aspects. Blood Surge. Draw blood from enemies, dealing 20% damage, and expel a Blood Nova, dealing 50% damage. Blood Surge's Nova damage is increased by 10% multiplicatively per enemy drained, up to 50% multiplicatively. The enhancement is Blood Surge heals you for 2.5% of your maximum life when drawing blood from enemies. If 4 or more enemies are drawn from, then heal for an additional 2.5% of your maximum life. Its modifiers are Supernatural and Paranormal. First up, Supernatural. Each time an enemy is hit by Blood Surge's Nova, you're fortified for 1% base life. While you have Fortify over 50% of your maximum life, Blood Surge deals 20% multiplicative increased damage. Paranormal. If an enemy is damaged by Blood Surge's Nova while you are healthy, then gain 1 stack of Overwhelming Blood. When you have 5 stacks of Overwhelming Blood, your next Blood Surge overpowers. This base effect means that it's important to save Blood Surge for when you're surrounded by many enemies, and this skill won't do much against single targets or bosses. The enhancement is good for keeping you alive, but really it's a stepping stone to Paranormal Blood Surge, the modifier that you should absolutely take for leveling. It grants a guaranteed overpower, which early on in the game can be a cheap way to get similar damage to a critical hit. Corpse Explosion is also an important staple of your leveling experience as a Necromancer, and adds some much needed burst AoE damage. While Blighted Corpse Explosion can be good later on, it needs some additional legendaries to really shine, so it might be good to avoid as you're leveling. So, go for Plagued for a bit of extra guaranteed damage. If you're not a fan of Blood Surge because of its cost and its lack of single target, then Bone Spear is going to be your new best friend. In fact, it's my personal favorite leveling skill because it does good enough AoE on its own, and it can do single target damage for those pesky bosses and elite mobs. Supernatural is the obvious modifier to pick up at first, but later on, Paranormal Bone Spear will do more damage once you pick up the bone-oriented passives like Serration further down the skill tree. As you're leveling your Necromancer, there's a few aspects you'll want to keep an eye out for. These aspects are absolute game changers and will dramatically enhance your gameplay with a particular build. In fact, they're so good that if you get one of these, you'll want to respec immediately to take advantage of it. First up is the offensive aspect of Explosive Mist. You've probably already seen this one in action from the beta. In the early game, you can blast through the entire campaign as an invincible blood mist ball, while you automatically trigger Corpse Explosion all over the screen. Optimize a little bit on the skill tree to generate a few more corpses, and you have an entire build that you can make off of just this one legendary aspect alone. Second is the splintering offensive aspect. This is absolutely devastating to enemies and takes any Bone Spear build to a whole new level. Interestingly, this aspect actually rolls higher than normal damage rate on two-handed weapons. At least that's what the tooltip says. Either way, the extra bonus damage here is quite crazy, and you'll want to keep an eye out for it. Finally is the offensive aspect of the Umbral. Now, even though this is available from the Codex of Power, you'll want to find this from a drop with the maximum roll of 4. Now, you can quickly change up your build into something very interesting, such as Corpse Explosion with the Darkness Miasma, or even Blight, which normally is a poor skill for leveling, but with this aspect, you'll have nearly limitless essence to cover the entire screen in darkness. Now, the Codex of Power is a new concept to the Diablo series, and it allows you to gain legendary aspects by simply completing a dungeon throughout your initial leveling playthrough. While these aspects are easy to unlock, they can only be imprinted with the minimum value that the legendary aspect can roll. That means, for example, that Umbral is up to 4 times more effective when it's dropped from an enemy rather than imprinting it from the Codex of Power. That's something to keep in mind as you're planning your journey out through Sanctuary, because many of these Codex of Power aspects are actually quite bad at their minimum values. Now let's talk about Endgame as a Necromancer. Now, our highly detailed builds on MAXROLL for Endgame won't be ready until shortly after the game's launch, because so many changes are likely to happen between now and launch, and we only use verified in-game data. But we can look at a couple things and make a few predictions now. Prediction number 1, Bone Spirit will be Necromancer's best in-game damage skill. We can see here that Bone Spirit scales off of increased essence, and it has an insane critical strike chance modifier. These two things combined can give, say, a Necromancer with 400 maximum essence a 1200% multiplicative modifier before even adding any other damage modifiers, easily making it the highest damage modifier in the entire game. Prediction number 2, Blood Mist will be an essential survival skill for any endgame build. Immune in this game is almost complete invincibility, and it's hard to ignore a mechanic that lets you be completely invincible. That really allows your build to be more glass cannon-y, and more damage means that you can reach for the heavens as you push the hardest content in the entire game. Prediction number 3. Necromancer minions won't be part of any super endgame build. The Necromancer minions, legendary aspects, and skill tree effects just really don't have anything that really allows them to scale super well into the endgame that I've seen. It's highly likely here that as you scale up the content and you need to become more glass cannony to do more damage, that your minions will simply evaporate. I think that's probably a good thing actually, as it means that the endgame builds will be more interactive. But it does sort of push minion-based builds into the leveling only and early endgame category in my opinion. Prediction 4. Corpse Explosion will be very good for more than just damage. We can already see on the skill tree that consuming corpses can return essence for essentially what is a free resource that only the Necromancer class gets. Powering your mana battery and generating infinite resources is a goal of any endgame build in a Diablo game, and I think that one of the mechanics that you'll use here is Corpse Explosion. Corpse Explosion also has an impressive damage modifier, and particularly the Miasma upgrade has the opportunity to shine here with a darkness-themed build that specializes in damage over time. Alright, all that said, let's dive into the skills for the Necromancer in detail. Skill points are unlocked by level ups and the renown system. As you spend more points, you can unlock more and more categories of skills. Each active skill can be leveled up to 5 times or more with items, increasing their power or reducing their cooldown with each additional rank. After unlocking a skill, you can enhance it with another point and then choose out of one of 2 modifiers to specialize it further. In addition, there are passives found all over the tree, attached as optional choices to certain skill clusters. They grant small bonuses to damage, defense, or utility under certain conditions, and help to round out your build by shifting it further in the direction that you want to take. All passives have 3 ranks and usually scale linearly. Now, Hemorrhage here is a good basic skill, but it's not my favorite. The most important effects here are its ability to generate blood orbs and the Initiates modifier, which can give you maximum fortify. Still, it's a channeled skill, so you can't micro with it effectively. Burst an enemy's blood, dealing 25% damage. Hemorrhage has a 20% chance to form a blood orb. Its enhancement. After picking up a blood orb, your next Hemorrhage also deals damage to enemies around your target and grants 2 additional essence per enemy hit. Alkalites. Hemorrhage gains an additional 20% additive attack speed while healthy. Initiates. Hemorrhage grants 1.6% base life as fortify each time it hits an enemy, and has a 1.5% chance per enemy hit to fortify you for 100% base life. Decompose is also a channeled skill, and doesn't allow you to micro with it effectively. And even though it generates corpses, 2.5 seconds is a very long time to wait around for one single corpse. Tear the flesh from an enemy, dealing 30% damage per second and forming a usable corpse with the flesh every 2.5 seconds. If an enemy dies while being decomposed, you gain 10 essence. Alkalites. Decompose slows enemies by 30%. Initiates. You and your minions deal 10% multiplicative increased damage to enemies who are being decomposed. Reap is my favorite basic skill, early on in the leveling process especially. Just look at it. It forms corpses, it does a nice arc of AoE damage, and it generates great resource. Sweep an ethereal scythe in front of you, dealing 12% damage. Hitting an enemy with Reap increases your damage reduction by 15% for 2 seconds. If an enemy hit by Reap dies within 2 seconds, you gain 30% additive attack speed for 3 seconds. Alkalites. Reap forms a corpse under the first enemy hit. It can occur only once every 5 seconds. Initiates. Reap instantly kills targets below 5% life. This does not work on bosses or players. Bone Splinters is a great basic skill option for bone builds, and it's something I'd recommend for endgame. Initiates in particular gives some free vulnerable. Fire 3 Bone Splinters, dealing 22% damage each. Each subsequent time an enemy is hit by the same cast of Bone Splinters, you gain 1 essence. Bone Splinters has a 30% chance to fire 2 additional projectiles if cast while you have 50 or more essence. Alkalites. Hitting the same enemy at least 3 times with the same cast of Bone Splinters grants 8% additive critical strike chance for 4 seconds. Initiates. Bone Splinters has a 20% chance per hit to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Blood Surge is probably the best, if not one of the best, AoE leveling skills in the entire game, and it does significant damage even without legendary aspects. Just be careful, because it's very expensive to cast. Draw blood from enemies, dealing 20% damage, and expel a blood nova, dealing 50% damage. Blood Surge's Nova damage is increased by 10% multiplicatively per enemy drained, up to 50% multiplicatively. Blood Surge heals you for 2.5% of your maximum life when drawing blood from enemies. If 4 or more enemies are drawn from, then heal for an additional 2.5% of your maximum life. Supernatural. Each time an enemy is hit by Blood Surge's Nova, you are fortified for 1% base life. While you have Fortify over 50% of your maximum life, Blood Surge deals 20% multiplicatively increased damage. Paranormal. If an enemy is damaged by Blood Surge's Nova while you're healthy, then gain 1 stack of Overwhelming Blood. When you have 5 stacks of Overwhelming Blood, your next Blood Surge overpowers. Blight isn't a great skill out of the gate, but if you have the right legendary aspects, it can be one of the best crowd control skills in the game. It might be a good contender for a potential group meta if one exists beyond just high damage values. Unleash a concentrated blight that deals 30% damage and leaves behind a defiled area, dealing 80% damage over 6 seconds. Blight slows enemies by 25%. Supernatural. Your minions deal 15% multiplicatively increased damage to enemies within Blight. Paranormal. Blight has a 30% chance to immobilize enemies for 1.55 seconds on impact. Sever has potential for its high damage output, but its close range makes it a difficult choice. We'll see if this actually makes it into a competitive build later down the road. A Spectre of You charges forward and attacks with its scythe for 63% damage, and then returns to you and attacks again for 21% damage. Sever damages enemies along its path for 25% of its initial damage. Supernatural. Sever deals 2% multiplicative increased damage for each minion you have upon cast. Paranormal. Every 4th cast of Sever makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Bone Spear is one of the best skills in the game for leveling, and it might even have a chance at endgame. Definitely keep your eyes on this one. Conjure a Bone Spear from the ground, dealing 85% damage and piercing through enemies. Bone Spear breaks into 3 shards when it's destroyed, dealing 10% damage each. Supernatural. Bone Spear makes the first enemy hit vulnerable for 3 seconds. Paranormal. Bone Spear has a 5% additive increased critical strike chance. If Bone Spear's primary projectile critically strikes, it fires 2 additional bone shards upon being destroyed. Now, Blood Lance is difficult to make usable due to its high cost and its clunky playstyle. There's some options to make this good at endgame, especially with its Blood Orb mechanic. Throw a Blood Lance that lingers in an enemy for 3 seconds, dealing 45% damage to the enemy and all other lanced enemies. Blood Lance pierces through enemies who are currently lanced, dealing 15% reduced damage to subsequent enemies after the first. Supernatural. After casting Blood Lance 8 times, your next cast of Blood Lance is guaranteed to overpower and spawns a Blood Orb under the first enemy hit. Paranormal. While at least 2 enemies or a boss are affected by Blood Lance, you gain 15% additive attack speed, and Blood Lance's essence cost is reduced by 2. Unliving Energy. Your maximum essence is increased by 3. Imperfectly Balanced. Your core skills cost 5% multiplicative more essence, but deal 10% multiplicative more damage. Hewed Flesh. Lucky Hit. Your damage has up to 4% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. This chance is doubled against bosses. Blood Mist is going to land in every single Necromancer build, as it gives you complete immunity. It's really hard to argue against it. Disperse into a Bloody Mist, becoming immune for 3 seconds. Your movement speed is reduced by 20%, and you periodically deal 2% damage to enemies, healing for 0.5% of your maximum life. Casting a skill that overpowers reduces the cooldown of Blood Mist by 2 seconds. Dreadful. Blood Mist fortifies you for 0.5% base life each time it hits an enemy. Ghastly. Blood Mist leaves behind a corpse every 1 second. Corpse Explosion is one of the best early AoE skills in the game because of its resource cost being effectively free for the Necromancer. You'll get to pick this one up, at least for leveling, if not keep it forever for other endgame builds. Detonate a corpse, dealing 75% damage to surrounding enemies. Corpse Explosion's radius is increased by 15%. Blighted. Corpse Explosion becomes a darkness skill, and instead of exploding, releases a vile miasma, dealing 110% shadow damage over 6 seconds. Plagued. Corpse Explosion deals 10% multiplicative increased damage to enemies that are slowed, stunned, or vulnerable. These damage bonuses can stack. Bone Prison is an underwhelming skill that likely won't see much use at all. If it does see some use, it might be for a utility group-based meta build. Unearth a prison of bones with 126 life that surrounds the target area for 6 seconds. If an enemy is trapped by Bone Prison, gain 15 essence, plus an additional 5 per enemy trapped. Dreadful. Fortify for 5% base life for each enemy trapped by Bone Prison. Ghastly. Enemies inside of Bone Prison are vulnerable. Spiked Armor. Gain 34 thorns. Don't take this passive. Grim Harvest. Consuming a corpse generates 3 essence. Fueled by Death. You deal 4% multiplicative increased damage for 4 seconds after consuming a corpse. Skeletal Warrior Mastery. Increase the damage and life of your skeletal warriors by 15% multiplicatively. Both curses to me are somewhat underwhelming. They could be useful in the endgame group meta, but until then they really shouldn't be considered for any build in my opinion. Iron Maiden here curses the target area. Enemies affected by Iron Maiden take 10% damage each time they deal direct damage. This lasts 10 seconds. Iron Maiden no longer costs essence. Instead, gain 5 essence for each enemy cursed. Does not work with enemies who are already cursed by Iron Maiden. Abhorrent. Heal for 5% of your maximum life when an enemy dies while afflicted with Iron Maiden. Horrid. When at least 3 enemies are afflicted by Iron Maiden, its damage is increased by 15% multiplicatively. Decrepify. Curse the target area. Enemies afflicted by Decrepify are slowed by 40% and deal 20% less damage for 10.38 seconds. Lucky Hit. Enemies hit while afflicted with Decrepify have up to a 10% chance to be stunned for 2.07 seconds. Abhorrent. Lucky Hit. Enemies hit while afflicted with Decrepify have up to a 15% chance to reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second. When you or your minions hit an enemy afflicted with Decrepify below 10% life, they are instantly killed. This does not work on bosses. Death's Reach. You deal 4% multiplicative increased damage to distant enemies. Death's Embrace. Close enemies take 2% multiplicative more damage from you and deal 3% less damage to you. Amplify Damage. You deal 3% multiplicative increased damage to cursed enemies. Skeletal Mage Mastery. Increase the damage and life of your skeletal mages by 15% multiplicatively. Corpse Tendrils is a take it or leave it kind of skill. It's quite good, but really it requires Corpse Explosion to be one of your skills to get the most out of it. It also is one of the best pixel pull skills in the entire game. That actually gives Necromancer 2 pixel pulls. So you might see Necro as one of the best group meta classes in the game due to this skill. Veins burst out of a corpse, pulling in enemies, stunning them for 3.12 seconds, and dealing 20% damage to them. This does not consume the corpse. Enemies who are in range of Corpse Tendrils are slowed by 50% before being pulled. Blighted. Corpse Tendrils have a 20% chance when damaging enemies to drop a blood orb. Plagued. Enemies damaged by Corpse Tendrils are made vulnerable for 3 seconds. Bone Spirit is, as we've already mentioned, the highest potential damage output skill in the entire game. Now that doesn't mean that Necromancer has the highest damage build in the entire game, as there's other factors to consider at endgame that are unpredictable at this time. Still, mark your builds with this skill, because it's likely to be in every endgame Necromancer's kit. One thing here to note about Bone Spirit is that its cost is all remaining essence. So you'll need a mana battery to really power this skill and juice it up to make it good. Consume all of your essence to conjure a Spirit of Bone that seeks enemies. Upon reaching an enemy, the spirit explodes, dealing 80% damage to the target and all surrounding enemies. Damage is increased by 3% multiplicative for each point of essence spent casting Bone Spirit. If Bone Spirit critically strikes, its cooldown is reduced by 6 seconds. This effect can only happen once per cast. Dreadful. After Bone Spirit hits an enemy, you generate 30 essence over the next 4 seconds. Ghastly. Bone Spirit has an additional 10% additive critical strike chance. Gruesome Mending. While below 50% life, you receive 10% additive more healing from all sources. Tides of Blood. Your blood skills deal 5% multiplicative increased over power damage. This bonus is doubled while you are healthy. Drain Vitality. Lucky Hit. Hitting enemies with blood skills has up to a 25% chance to fortify you for 2% base life. Coalesced Blood. While healthy, your blood skills deal 6% multiplicatively increased damage. Transfusion. Blood orbs also heal your minions for 15% of the amount. Necrotic Carapace. When a corpse is formed from your skills or your minions, fortify for 2% base life. Reaper's Pursuit. Damaging enemies with darkness skills increases your movement speed by 5% for 3 seconds. Gloom. When you damage enemies with darkness skills, they take 2% multiplicatively increased shadow damage from you and your minions for 2 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Crippling Darkness. Lucky hit. Darkness skills have up to a 15% chance to stun for 1 second. Terror. Darkness skills deal 3% multiplicative bonus damage to enemies who are slowed, and 3% bonus damage multiplicatively to enemies who are stunned or immobilized. These bonuses stack and are applied to shadow damage dealt by your minions. Serration. Your bone skills have a 0.5% additive increased critical strike chance for each 10 essence you have upon cast. Rapid Ossification. Every 100 essence you spend reduces the cooldowns of your bone skills by 0.5 seconds. Compound Fracture. After critically striking 10 times with bone skills, your bone skills deal 5% multiplicatively increased damage for 5 seconds. Evulsion. Your bone skills deal 6% multiplicatively increased critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. Now, Necromancer's ultimates are all fairly bad, and maybe they're only really useful during the leveling stage of the game. They just aren't strong enough to fit into builds beyond a little bit of extra utility. Keep your eyes closer to some of the other abilities that we've already mentioned. Blood Wave. Conjure a tidal wave of blood that deals 90% damage and knocks back enemies. Blood Wave slows enemies by 50% for 4.15 seconds. Blood Wave leaves behind 3 blood orbs as it travels. Army of the Dead. Call forth the deep buried dead. Volatile skeletons emerge over the next 7 seconds that explode around enemies, dealing 30% damage. When Army of the Dead's volatile skeletons explode, they have a 15% chance to leave behind a corpse. Army of the Dead also raises your skeletal warriors and skeletal mages. Bone Storm. A swirling storm of bones surrounds you and your golem, dealing 180% damage to nearby enemies over 10 seconds. Your damage reduction is increased by 15% while Bone Storm is active, and your critical strike chance is increased by 20% additively while Bone Storm is active. Golem Mastery. Increase the damage and life of your golem by 15% multiplicatively. Stand Alone. Increases damage reduction by 6%, reduced by 2% for each active minion. Memento Mori. Sacrificing both skeletal warriors and skeletal mages increases their sacrifice bonuses by 20%. Hellbent Commander. Your minions deal 10% multiplicatively increased damage while you are close to them. Every 5 seconds, your skeletal priest's healing will heal your skeletons for 20% of their maximum life. By the way, let me pause here and mention what a skeletal priest is, because it's not made obvious anywhere in the game except a weird tooltip. So a skeletal priest, at least to my understanding right now, is the skeleton that you summon from a corpse when you've already summoned all of your skeletal warriors and your skeletal mages. So it only lives for a second, but it actually does some healing to all of your minions. It's a weird mechanic that just really isn't explained anywhere, so I figured this was a good opportunity to explain it. Inspiring Leader. After you've been healthy for at least 4 seconds, you and your minions gain 4% additive attack speed. Death's Defense. Your minions cannot lose more than 75% of their maximum life from a single damage instance. Alright, now we're getting into the key passives. You can only take one of these, and they're very important for your build, so you're going to have to choose very, very wisely. Kalan's Edict. After not taking damage in the last 3 seconds, your minions gain 15% additive attack speed. While you have at least 7 minions, this bonus is doubled. Shadow Blight. Shadow damage infects enemies with Shadow Blight for 2 seconds. You and your minions deal 10% multiplicative bonus damage to enemies with Shadow Blight. Every 10th time an enemy receives shadow damage from you or your minions while they're affected by Shadow Blight, they take Rathma's Vigor. Increase your maximum life by 10% multiplicatively. After being healthy for 15 seconds, your next blood skill overpowers. Ossified Essence. By far the best key passive for the Necromancer. Your bone skills deal 1% multiplicative increased damage per point of essence you have above 50 upon cast. Alright, now let's head over to each of the legendary aspects. Legendary aspects are essential for your build, and when you're leveling, you'll want to change your build to morph to the aspects that you find, particularly the ones that we mentioned earlier in this video. I want to mention something here, by the way. Many of you are already preparing your builds for launch, and you're theory crafting endgame builds based on some of the data mined calculators that are out there in the wild. I'd caution you here, while this is fun, these data mined calculators often include information that might not actually be available in the game or might not drop until higher world tiers. We do already know that some of these legendary aspects are actually rarer than others, and we've heard that even uniques have certain rarity tiers. All that said, every single legendary aspect in this video was actually found and confirmed from an in-game drop during the open beta in March. I've done a lot of legwork here to protect you and the community from overhype information that might not actually be available in the game at launch. That means that the information here is reliable and correct, and also it's available to your character as you level up during the game. And while Blizzard might change some of the damage values on these aspects for balance, it's unlikely that they're going to completely remove them from the game at this point. Alright, first let's cover the Necromancer only aspects. Blighted. This is a defensive aspect. You gain 50% multiplicative increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. Bloodseekers. Bloodlance deals 15 to 30% multiplicative increased damage to its primary target per lanced enemy. Blood-bathed. This is an offensive aspect. Blood Surge's Nova echoes again after a short delay, dealing 70 to 60% multiplicatively less damage. The offensive aspect of Bursting Bones. When a segment of Bone Prison is destroyed or expires, it deals damage in an area around itself. Offensive aspect of the Damned. You deal 30 to 40% multiplicatively increased shadow damage to enemies afflicted by both Decrepify and Iron Maiden. The offensive aspect of Empowering Reaper. Critical strikes from Sever have a 10% chance to spawn a pool of Blight under the target that deals 20% bonus damage. This effect can only happen once every 3 seconds. Fast Blood, offensive aspect. Blood orbs reduce your ultimate cooldown by 0.5 seconds. Flesh Rending, offensive aspect. After Decompose spawns a corpse, gain 10 essence. Offensive aspect of Grasping Veins. Gain 10% additive increased critical strike chance for 6 seconds when you cast Corpse Tendrils. You deal 30% multiplicatively bonus critical strike damage to enemies damaged by Corpse Tendrils. Hulking offensive aspect. Your golem has a 10% chance to reduce its active cooldown by 2 seconds and a 5% chance to spawn a corpse each time it damages an enemy with a normal attack. Offensive aspect of Plunging Darkness. Bone Prison spawns a pool of Blight that deals 50 to 100% bonus damage over 6 seconds. Offensive aspect of Potent Blood. While at full life, blood orbs grant 10 essence. Offensive aspect of Reanimation. Your skeletons gain increased damage while alive, up to 20 to 30% multiplicative after 10 seconds. Requiem, offensive aspect. You gain 3.0 maximum essence per active minion. Sacrificial offensive aspect. Your sacrifice bonuses are increased by 15%. Splintering offensive aspect. Bone Spear's primary attack makes enemies hit beyond the first vulnerable for 1.5 to 2.5 seconds. Bone Shards from Bone Spear deal 50 to 100% on a one-hander and 125 to 250% on a two-hander bonus damage to vulnerable enemies and pierce them. Offensive aspect of Swelling Curse. Bone Spirit deals increased damage based on distance traveled, up to 15% multiplicatively. Offensive aspect of Torment. Critical strikes with bone skills increase your essence regeneration by 20% multiplicatively for 4 seconds. Torturous offensive aspect. Enemies affected by your Iron Maiden have a 15% chance to be stunned for 1 second when they deal direct damage. Unyielding Commander's offensive aspect. While Army of the Dead is active, your minions gain 70% additive attack speed and take 90% reduced damage. Offensive aspect of Ultimate Shadow. Bone Storm and Blood Wave are also darkness skills. They deal shadow damage and gain additional effects. Enemies damaged by Bone Storm take in shadow damage over 2 seconds. Blood Wave desecrates the ground as it travels, dealing shadow damage over 4 seconds. Offensive aspect of Explosive Mist. Blood Mist triggers corpse explosion on surrounding corpses. When Blood Mist detonates a corpse, its cooldown is reduced by 0.5 to 1.5 seconds. Resource aspect of Frenzied Dead. Each time one of your summoning minions damages an enemy, they gain 10 to 14% additive attack speed for 3.0 seconds, up to 30 to 42% additive. Rotting Resource aspect. Decompose can chain up to 2 additional targets. When Decompose spawns a corpse, it has a 30 to 60% chance to spawn a corpse under all afflicted targets. Coldbringer's resource aspect. Every 10 seconds, your cold skeletal mages cast a blizzard that deals cold damage and continuously chills enemies for 8% over 6.0 seconds. Resource aspect of Hungry Blood. When Blood Lance hits an enemy that is already lanced, it has a 10 to 20% chance to fire a Blood Lance at a nearby enemy. Vicious resource aspect. Your maximum number of skeletal mages is increased by 2. Blood-soaked resource aspect. Blood Mist leaves a trail that lasts for 4 seconds and deals shadow damage per second to enemies who stand in it. Your movement speed is no longer reduced while Blood Mist is active. Bloodgetter's utility aspect. Your maximum number of skeletal warriors is increased by 2. Cadaverous utility aspect. Consuming a corpse increases the damage of your next core skill by 5 to 10% multiplicatively, up to 25 to 50% multiplicatively. Utility aspect of the Embalmer. Consuming a corpse has a 20 to 30% chance to spawn a blood orb. Tidal utility aspect. Blood Wave fires 2 additional waves, each dealing 50 to 60% multiplicative less damage than the previous. Alright, now that we've covered all the Necromancer only aspects, let's jump into the aspects that are available for all classes. Defensive aspect of the Deflecting Barrier. While you have a barrier active, there's a 20% chance to ignore incoming direct damage from distant enemies. Defensive aspect of Disobedience. You gain 0.25 through 0.50% multiplicative increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 25 to 50% multiplicative. Edgemaster's defensive aspect. Skills deal up to 24 through 34% multiplicative increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the maximum benefit when you have full primary resource. Eluding defensive aspect. Becoming injured and crowd controlled grants you unstoppable for 4 seconds. This effect has a 40 through 20 second cooldown. Defensive aspect of the Expectant. Attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill cast by 5 to 10% multiplicatively, up to 50% multiplicatively. Defensive aspect of Inner Calm. Deal 3.0 to 10.0% multiplicative increased damage for each second that you stand still, up to 30% multiplicatively. The offensive aspect of Might. Basic skills grant 25% damage reduction for 4 to 8 seconds. Needle Flare offensive aspect. Thorn's damage dealt has a 20 to 40% chance to deal damage to all enemies around you. Damaging an elite enemy grants you a barrier absorbing up to end damage for 10 seconds. This effect can only happen once every 30 seconds. Rapid offensive aspect. Basic skills gain 23 to 33% additive attack speed. Offensive aspect of Retribution. Distant enemies have a 15% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you. You deal 30 through 50% multiplicative increased damage to stunned enemies. Offensive aspect of Shared Misery. Lucky Hit. When you hit a crowd-controlled enemy, there's up to a 30 to 50% chance for that crowd control effect to spread to another unaffected enemy. The Singed Extremities offensive aspect. After Immobilize wears off, enemies are slowed by 25 to 35% for 4 seconds. Offensive aspect of the Umbral. Restore 1 to 4 of your primary resource when you crowd control an enemy. Accelerating offensive aspect. Critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 20 to 40% additive for 3 seconds. Exploiter's resource aspect. You have a 20% additive increased crowd control duration and deal 20 to 50% multiplicative increased damage to unstoppable enemies. Starlight resource aspect. Gain 10 to 20 of your primary resource for every 20% of your life that you heal. Conceited resource aspect. Deal 23% to 33% multiplicative increased damage while you have a barrier active. Protecting utility aspect. When hit while not healthy, a magical bubble is summoned around you for 3.0 to 5.0 seconds. While standing in the bubble, players are immune. Can only occur once every 90 seconds. Utility aspect of the Crowded Sage. You heal for N life per second for each close enemy up to Y life per second. Assimilation utility aspect. You have an 8% additive increased dodge chance versus enemies affected by damage over time effects. When you dodge, you gain 5 to 10 of your primary resource. Smiting utility aspect. You have a 13 to 25% multiplicative increased critical strike chance against injured enemies. While you are healthy, you gain a 25 to 50% multiplicative increased crowd control duration. Now that we're in the pre-launch era of Diablo 4, my next videos on the channel will cover each class in detail. I'm hoping to regularly make new class guides as the game changes, and we'll be able to track how skills, legendary aspects, and unique items for each class change over time. If detailed information like this interests you, then please subscribe. Oh yeah, and let me know down in the comments if you like this new style of guide, as well as the new lens on the camera. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace!